Naval Intelligence Commander Dr. Paul Chabot, who has been following the war in Iran along with us ever since it started. Dr. Chabot, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, look, my pleasure. Today, I think we do feel a little bit more optimistic about where we were just a few days ago. So, certainly, the Trump administration had heard that there was an agreement basically that Iran's going to allow commercial shipping. But at the same time, the United States is going to keep the pressure on with the full blockade. Now, as of today, so far, it looks like a tanker through UAE has already gone through. Oil prices are dropping, which is good news, about 10 or 11%. But there's some other big news happening. Pakistan is very active behind the scenes in negotiating with us and Iran. And then, of course, you also have some other big news is Israel and Hezbollah have also agreed to a ceasefire. More details we could dig down on, but those are some pretty important highlights for today.
Absolutely, and all really coming within a day as well after talks that we saw earlier this week, Dr. Chabot, kind of fizzled after 21 hours over the weekend, but there's more hope at this point that maybe a deal could be reached at this point.
Yeah, there is. And there's a lot of different ways to look at this. First off, blockades historically from navies, which is what they have been trained to do for generations, has had an impact. On average, Iran is losing about maybe 600 million to $1 billion a day overall. At the same time, the Trump administration has signaled that they may unfreeze about $20 billion in assets for Iran. And so those are some pretty good sort of opening salvos. But remember, we are still at a ceasefire point only with further negotiations. Pakistan really doing a lot behind the scenes, not only with the United States and Iran, but you also look at Israel and Hezbollah. With that ceasefire to hold, that would be a pretty incredible moment in history in this region because things seem to change pretty sporadically. But as of now, the U.S. Navy remains strong, keeping that blockade in place with hopeful negotiations to continue in the days ahead.
Yeah, and Pakistan as well, and mediators in general really working to find a compromise on the key sticking points, especially Iran's nuclear program and the Strait of Hormuz. The fact that the strait is back open shows that maybe that part of the negotiations are working. I'm going to be interested to see with the Iran nuclear program where things end up going with that, because that is such a huge thing for President Trump, and Iran really at this point was showing no signs of backing down on that.
That's really the most important part. If the Trump administration is going to walk away with a win for this, for the Middle East and for his presidency, it has to include really going after the Iranian nuclear program, their enrichment, and not only ceasing it, but also either having US or some other forces come in to remove what has largely been buried through bombing. Look, from Iran, from a energy perspective, you need about 2 to 3% of enriched uranium. They're up to 60%, which is very close for nuclear capability for destruction. So there's a big gap. And going after that enriched uranium has to be a win for the Trump administration for us to really see things move forward.
So when do you think we could see talks start back up, like true talks in earnest? Could it be as soon as this weekend, do you think?
I do. I think things right now, at least how the White House press is positioning this to us, is that yes, there are good back channels going on, not only through Pakistan, but also the US State Department has been very active in directly communicating, not necessarily with Hezbollah per se, but with Lebanon. So there's a lot of active discussions. We're coming up well on that 2 week period, and I would not be surprised if we hear some more positive remarks in the next 24 to 48 hours.
So just to put a bow on these discussions and really the war in general right now with where things stand, what are the
Yeah.
big things that you are keeping an eye on as we move through the next hours and days ahead?
We've always been worried about sort of the four proxies that Iran has funded throughout the Middle East. And when you look at Iran recently signaling in the last 24 hours to Hezbollah to work on the ceasefire with Israel, that in itself is pretty remarkable. And I think it's why, in many ways, we put our guard down. From a military perspective, we're not going to put our guard down because there are adversaries within the Iranian regime Certainly, there are folks that probably want to negotiate, but there is still a very hard line anti-Israel, anti-American. We want to watch and see who the negotiators come through Pakistan, because the rumblings before were that it was convoluted and not very direct on what they could actually accomplish. So it's one thing to say we're going to do it, but to actually see it unfold in the Middle East has historically been very difficult.
Absolutely. And certainly, Iran's been a nuclear threat for quite some time. That's been a fear for quite some time at this point as well. And again, just the fact that we were at this point last weekend where they came out of this with no deal. I am curious
Yeah.
what any kind of compromise just it would look like with the nuclear program. Just so as we get into that, and then of course the Strait of Hormuz as well. We've got Iran still controlling it at this point. What will that look like in the long run as well? Just given how important that is to the world's economy.
Yeah, Iran's going to have to give up the thought that they had 2 weeks ago of having any control over Strait of Hormuz. International law is very clear. Straits like the Strait of Hormuz, there is no control by a nation over it. It is free for seas. So that is a non-starter in a negotiation, which I do not anticipate Iran to bring forward. I do think that from an energy perspective, that's where we can look at the nuclear capability potentially of a 2 to 3% enrichment, highly monitored by IEA or other allied forces to make sure that they do not get to that enrichment phase where they were at 60%, but also their ballistic missile capability. Remember, a few weeks ago, they shot 2 missiles at Diego Garcia, which is thousands of miles beyond what we in the open source media thought that they could potentially reach. So they do have the capability to reach Europe. Removing any sort of nuclear capability for them to do so would set things on the right track for peace.
Absolutely. And we know at this point, given where things have been, it expect the unexpected in a lot of ways as well with this. A lot that we had to sort through today, and we're glad you were here to do it along with us, Dr. Chabot. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Just about 4:30.